My hands trembled as I applied lipstick in the rearview mirror, the coral shade I'd worn to our high school prom 43 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, 61 years old, sitting in a Target parking lot at 3 in the afternoon, preparing to see Thomas Mitchell for the first time since 1982. My daughter Sarah had arranged this through Facebook, bless her meddling heart. "Mom, you need to get out there," she'd insisted last month, after finding me crying over Robert's anniversary card, the one he'd left for me to find after he died. Dad's been gone 2 years. It's time. But this wasn't just getting out there. This was excavating my past with a backhoe. I checked my watch, 15 minutes early, as always. The Olive Garden stretched before me, its brick facade ordinary and safe, chosen specifically because it held no memories. Thomas had suggested it in his message. Somewhere public, somewhere we can talk without ghosts. His profile picture showed silver hair, where once there had been thick brown waves. Laugh lines around eyes that still crinkled the way they did when he'd whispered jokes during Mr. Henderson's chemistry class. In the photo, he was holding a golden retriever, smiling with the easy confidence of a man who'd made peace with his choices. The drive here had been a blur of memories and second-guessing. Thomas Mitchell, captain of the debate team, the boy who'd walked me home every day senior year, carrying my books and my dreams of becoming a writer. He'd promised to write from Northwestern, and he had, passionate letters full of observation and longing that I'd kept in a shoebox under my bed until I married Robert. Then I'd burned them in the backyard fire pit, watching our young love turn to ash while my new husband grilled hamburgers, oblivious to the ritual taking place beside him. Now, Thomas was recently divorced, according to his carefully worded Facebook message. Amicable, he'd written. We grew apart after the boys left for college. Sharon and I realized we'd been co-parenting more than partnering for years. The same thing that had nearly happened to Robert and me during his worst depressive episodes, except we'd fought through it, mainly because I was too stubborn to quit and too Catholic to consider divorce a real option. I pulled down the visor and checked my reflection one more time. The navy dress was new, bought specifically for today, after rejecting 12 others that made me look either too eager or too matronly. My hair, freshly colored to hide the gray that had invaded after Robert's diagnosis, fell in soft waves around my face. I'd lost 15 pounds since the funeral. Grief and loneliness were excellent appetite suppressants, and while I'd never be the 18-year-old girl Thomas had loved, I thought I looked like a woman worth having coffee with. The parking lot was busy with the early dinner crowd, families with young children who reminded me painfully of my own kids at that age. Sarah had been skeptical when I told her about Thomas reaching out. "Mom, are you sure about this? What if he's not who you remember? What if he's some creepy old guy trying to relive his glory days?" But when I'd shown her his Facebook profile, successful accountant, volunteer at an animal shelter, grandfather to twin girls, she'd softened. "He looks kind," she admitted, "like Dad was kind, but different." Different. That was the word that had been haunting me for weeks. Robert had been many wonderful things. Steady, loyal, patient with my moods and dreams. But he'd never made my pulse race the way it was racing now as I applied one final coat of lipstick and prepared to walk into whatever this afternoon would bring. Inside, the hostess was probably 22, with perfect skin and a smile that suggested she'd never had to wonder if she'd made the right choices in life. Her name tag read Brittany, and she looked at me with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for customers over 40. "Table for 2, I said, my voice shakier than I'd intended. The name should be Margaret Kellerman. She led me to a booth in the back, and I was grateful for the relative privacy. The lunch crowd was thinning out, leaving mostly elderly couples and business people grabbing late lunches. I positioned myself to face the entrance, then immediately wondered if that made me look too eager. Should I pretend to read the menu? Check my phone? I felt like a teenager again, all nervous energy and second-guessing. My palms were damp as I smoothed my dress and tried to calm my breathing. The familiar weight of wedding rings was gone from my finger. I'd finally removed them last spring after Sarah gently suggested it might be time. But I still caught myself twisting the empty space when I was nervous. The tan line had finally faded, leaving only a slight indentation in the flesh, a ghost of 37 years of marriage. At 3:47, I was watching the clock obsessively. I saw him walk through the entrance. Time hadn't been cruel to Thomas Mitchell, just honest. His shoulders were still broad beneath a well-fitted gray sweater, his posture erect despite carrying the years we'd both accumulated. His hair was silver but thick, styled in a way that suggested he still cared about his appearance without being vain about it. When his eyes met mine across the restaurant, scanning the room until he found me, my breath caught in my throat. Those were the same eyes that had looked at me with such tenderness when we were 18, the same eyes that had filled with tears when he'd said goodbye at the train station. They were blue-gray, the color of storm clouds, and they still held that intelligence that had first attracted me to him during sophomore English when he'd raised his hand to argue with Mrs. Peterson about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby. Margaret. His voice was deeper now, seasoned by decades of board meetings and parent-teacher conferences, but it still sent a familiar flutter through my chest. He approached the table slowly, giving me time to stand, to prepare for whatever greeting we'd settled on. Thomas. I rose, and we embraced awkwardly, both of us unsure of the protocol. A handshake seemed too formal, a hug too intimate, so we settled on something in between, a brief embrace that lasted just long enough for me to register that he smelled different now. Expensive cologne, instead of the drugstore aftershave he'd worn in high school. But underneath it was something achingly familiar, something that transported me instantly to his mother's living room on Sunday afternoons when we'd pretend to study while really just finding excuses to touch each other. We sat, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied his face, cataloging the changes, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years of smiling, the slight softening of his jaw, the way his hands now bore age spots I remembered being smooth and young. He was doing the same to me, I realized, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks under his scrutiny. "You look wonderful," he said finally, and his voice carried the sincerity that had always been his hallmark. Thomas Mitchell had never been good at social lies. "You're a terrible liar, Thomas Mitchell. I look like what I am, a widow pushing retirement with arthritis in her knees and reading glasses permanently attached to a chain around my neck." I touched the glasses self-consciously. When did we become people who need accessories to see menus? He laughed, and it was like stepping back in time. Rich and warm and completely genuine, the laugh that had gotten us in trouble in study hall when Sister Mary Catherine would glare at us over her bifocals. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before I left for Northwestern?" The question caught me off guard. I remembered everything about that night. The way we'd sat on the hood of his Buick watching the stars, the way he'd held my hand like he was memorizing the feel of it, the way we'd both cried without caring who might see, that we'd find our way back to each other. "That we'd find our way back to each other," he repeated, and his voice was soft with memory. "Took us 40 years, but here we are." The waitress appeared then, young and efficient, probably working her way through college the way I had, the way Thomas had tried to. She took our drink orders, iced tea for both of us, with lemon for me, plain for him, and left us with menus we both ignored. "Your daughter found me on Facebook," he said once we were alone again. "Sarah, right? She looks like you did in high school. Same dark hair, same stubborn chin." She's stubborn like me, too, decided I needed to live again, as she puts it. I traced patterns in the condensation that was already forming on my water glass, a nervous habit I'd carried since childhood. She doesn't understand that I was living, differently than before Robert died, but living nonetheless. "But were you?" The question was gentle but direct, classic Thomas. Really living, or just going through the motions? I considered lying, But we were too old for that now. Going through the motions, mostly. I had routines: grocery shopping on Tuesday, library on Thursday, lunch with my book club once a month. I kept busy. But I paused, searching for the right words. I felt like I was watching my life from outside myself, like I was an actor playing the role of a widow rather than actually being one. He nodded, understanding immediately. Robert was a good man. The question I'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. He was steady, kind, patient with my moods and my phases. He loved me the way you love someone you choose deliberately, not someone you're struck by lightning for. I met his eyes. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Sharon was the same for me, a conscious decision rather than an inevitable force of nature. We had 2 boys, raised them well, lived quietly in Evanston. I became an accountant. She taught elementary school. We were compatible. An accountant? I couldn't hide my surprise. The Thomas I'd known had wanted to be a journalist, to travel the world writing about far-off places and important people. He talked for hours about working for National Geographic or Time magazine, about the stories he'd tell and the changes he'd make. That's not what you planned. No, he smiled ruefully, and I saw traces of the dreams he'd abandoned in the lines around his eyes. But life has a way of making plans for us, doesn't it? The journalism thing didn't pan out. Too many people chasing too few jobs, and I had a family to support by then. The math was always easier for me than the words, anyway. I wanted to protest, to remind him of the beautiful letters he'd written me during those brief months when we tried to make long-distance work. Letters full of observation and poetry, descriptions of campus life that made me feel like I was walking beside him through the quad. But I didn't. We'd both made compromises, both chosen security over dreams. It wasn't a conversation for our first meeting in 4 decades. "Tell me about your children," I said instead, steering us towards safer ground. His face brightened immediately, the way parents' faces do when given permission to brag. David's a doctor in Portland, emergency medicine. He married his college girlfriend, and they have twin girls who are 8 now. They're absolute terrors, and I adore them completely. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to photos with the ease of a devoted grandfather. This is them at Christmas last year. 2 gap-toothed grins stared back at me from the screen, girls with Thomas's eyes and their father's serious expression. They're beautiful. "And your other son?" "Michael's in Chicago, works in technology, something with computer programming that I pretend to understand. He's not married yet, but he's been with his girlfriend Amanda for 5 years now. I keep hoping they'll make it official, but young people today seem to have different timelines than we did." "What about yours?" he asked, tucking his phone away. "You mentioned Sarah. Any others?" "A son, Michael." I paused, realizing what I was about to say. "We both named our sons Michael." "Both born in 1985? "April." My voice was barely a whisper. "March." We stared at each other across the table, the weight of shared experience settling between us like a presence. In 1985, we'd both been young parents, both living parallel lives in different cities, both probably wondering sometimes about the path not taken while we changed diapers and attended Little League games. "My Michael is a teacher like his sister," I continued, my voice steadier now. "High school English, if you can believe it. He has Robert's patience and my love of books. He's married to a lovely woman named Jennifer, and they have a son, my grandson David. He's 6. "David and David," Thomas said softly. "We really did live parallel lives, didn't we?" The food arrived before I could answer. Salads we'd ordered without looking at the menu, both of us defaulting to the safest choices. Neither of us ate much. Instead, we talked, really talked, for the first time in over 4 decades. We covered the basics first, the safe territory of careers and children, and the ordinary milestones that make up a life. Thomas told me about his accounting firm, how he'd built it from nothing into a moderately successful business before selling it 3 years ago. I told him about my work at the library, 28 years of helping people find the books they needed and the ones they didn't know they wanted. "You always loved books," he said. "I remember you carrying around Jane Eyre our senior year, reading it during lunch because you said cafeteria food was easier to stomach when you had Bronte to distract you." The fact that he remembered such a small detail sent warmth flooding through me. I still reread it every year, and Pride and Prejudice, and all the books we talked about reading together someday. What books were those? Everything, remember? We were going to read our way through the Modern Library's list of the 100 best novels. We got through maybe 6 before you left for college. He was quiet for a moment, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "I finished the list," he said finally. "You did?" "It took me 23 years, but I finished it. Every time I started a new book, I'd think about what you might say about it, how we might discuss it if you were there." He set down his fork. "Pathetic, isn't it?" "Not pathetic, sweet." I reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. I kept a list, too, of all the books I read. I'd write little notes in the margins about passages I thought you'd like, arguments I wished I could have with you about the themes. "Show me." "What?" "The next time we see each other, bring one of your annotated books. I want to see what you were thinking all these years." The assumption that there would be a next time sent a flutter through my chest. "Thomas, I know, it's presumptuous, but Margaret, sitting here with you, talking to you, it's like finding a piece of myself I thought I'd lost forever. I don't want to lose it again." The intensity in his voice silenced whatever protest I'd been about to make. Around us, the restaurant hummed with ordinary conversation. Families discussing weekend plans, business colleagues reviewing quarterly reports, teenagers arguing about movies. Normal life carrying on while my world tilted on its axis. "Tell me about the hard times," I said, deflecting from the emotion building between us. "What? In your marriage? I want to know about the times when you were unhappy, when you thought about leaving, when you wondered if you'd made the right choice." He studied my face, perhaps wondering if this was safe territory or a minefield. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because I need to know I wasn't just a fantasy for you. I need to know that what we had was real, not just the golden haze of nostalgia making everything seem better than it was." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "You're afraid we're romanticizing the past." "Aren't we? We were kids, Thomas. We dated for what, 8 months? We never lived together, never had to deal with bills and mortgages and sick children and in-laws. We never had to see each other at our worst." He was quiet for a long time, considering my words. When he spoke, his voice was careful, thoughtful. "You're right. We don't know how we would have handled the real challenges of adult life together. But Margaret, what we had wasn't just teenage infatuation. It was deeper than that, even at 18. "How can you be sure?" "Because I've spent 43 years comparing every feeling to what I felt for you, and nothing ever came close. Not even with Sharon, who was a good woman and a good mother, and deserved better than a husband who was emotionally unavailable because he was carrying a torch for a girl he'd known decades earlier." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest, and more intimate than any physical touch. I felt tears prick my eyes, for him, for Sharon, for all of us who tried to love completely while carrying the ghosts of previous loves. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For what?" "For haunting your marriage, for being the standard no one else could meet." He shook his head. "You don't apologize for being loved, Margaret. And besides, it worked both ways. Do you think Robert never noticed that part of you was always somewhere else?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Had Robert known? In 37 years of marriage, had he sensed that I was comparing our quiet, steady love to the passionate intensity I'd shared with Thomas? Had he felt like he was competing with a ghost? He never said anything. Would you have wanted him to? No, I admitted. It would have hurt him, and it wouldn't have changed anything. I was committed to our marriage, to our family. But you're right, part of me was always 17 and wondering, what if? Tell me about the hard times in your marriage, he said gently, echoing my earlier request. I need to know you're not just romanticizing what we have here. So I told him about Robert's depression, the way it would descend like a fog and steal the man I'd married, leaving behind a hollow stranger who could barely function. About the months when I'd felt like a single parent, juggling 2 small children and a husband who couldn't get out of bed. About the financial stress during the worst episodes when Robert couldn't work and I was waitressing at night to keep us afloat. There was one night, I said, my voice barely audible, when the kids were maybe 8 and 10 and Robert had been in bed for 3 weeks. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, angry at him for being sick, and angry at myself for being angry at him. I drove to the train station, where we said goodbye, and I sat in the parking lot and imagined getting on a train and just disappearing. But you didn't. No, I went home, made dinner, helped with homework, pretended everything was fine. Because that's what you do when you're a mother, when you've made promises. Do you regret it, staying? I considered the question honestly. No. Robert was a good father when he was well, and the kids needed stability. And he got help, went to therapy, found medication that worked. We had good years too, especially after the kids left home. But I paused, searching for the right words. I never felt like I could be completely myself with him. There were parts of me I kept hidden because they didn't fit with who he needed me to be. What parts? The dreamer, the romantic, the woman who wanted to travel and take risks and have passionate conversations about books and life and meaning. Robert was practical. He liked routine, predictability. He thought my book club was frivolous and couldn't understand why I cried at movies. Thomas nodded slowly. Sharon used to say I was too intense, too emotional. She couldn't understand why I'd get worked up about politics or current events, why I'd spend hours reading about places I never visit. She wanted peace, and I wanted more. More what? More connection, more depth. Someone who understood that the world is vast and beautiful and terrible, and that it matters how we move through it. The description resonated through me like a tuning fork. Yes, exactly that. I think, he said carefully, that we were both married to perfectly nice people who were wrong for us in fundamental ways. But we stayed. We stayed because we were responsible adults who'd make commitments, because divorce seemed like failure, because we thought love was supposed to be comfortable rather than transformative. And now? Before he could answer, our waitress appeared to clear our barely touched salads and offer dessert menus. We declined, but Thomas ordered coffee for both of us without asking if I wanted any. He remembered that I always wanted coffee after meals, another small detail preserved across decades. When she left, he leaned forward, his voice intense. Now I think we're old enough to know the difference between comfort and compromise, between love and habit. I think we're old enough to choose what we want rather than what we think we should want. What do you want, Thomas? He met my eyes steadily. You. I want to know who you've become, what you think about when you're alone, what makes you laugh now. I want to take you to places you've dreamed about and watch you discover them. I want to read books with you and argue about politics and lie in bed on Sunday mornings talking about everything and nothing. My heart was racing so fast I thought he might hear it across the table. We're 60-something years old. Isn't it too late for all that? Is it? Do you feel too old for passion, for adventure, for the kind of love that changes you? I thought about my quiet house, my predictable routines, the way I'd been sleepwalking through my days since Robert's death. Then I thought about sitting here with Thomas, feeling more alive and present than I had in years. No, I whispered, I don't feel too old. Then what's stopping us? Fear. The word escaped before I could stop it. I'm terrified, Thomas. What if we try this and discover we're strangers now? What if the magic was just being young and we can't recapture it? What if we hurt each other again? We probably will hurt each other, he said matter-of-factly. That's what people do when they love each other. They disappoint and forgive and try again. But Margaret, isn't the risk of heartbreak worth the possibility of happiness? I don't know, is it? He reached across the table and took both my hands in his. His palms were warm and slightly rough, working man's hands, despite the office job. Let me ask you something. If you could go back and change things, would you have waited for me? Would you have been brave enough to build a life with someone whose future was uncertain? The question I'd been asking myself for 43 years. Yes, I said without hesitation. God help me, yes. I would have waited. I would have taken the risk. Then take it now. Not the same risk. We're not kids anymore. We don't have to bet everything on forever. But take the risk of seeing where this goes. Take the risk of being happy. I stared at our joined hands, at the wedding ring tan lines on both our fingers, at the age spots and wrinkles that marked us as survivors of full lives. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet bustle, but I felt like we were in a bubble, suspended between past and future. What would it look like? I asked finally. This, whatever this is. I don't know. That's what we'd figure out together. Phone calls, visits. Maybe you could come to Chicago sometimes, and I could spend time here. Maybe we could travel together. Ireland like you always wanted, or Italy, or just weekend trips to places we've never seen. You'd do that? Leave your life in Chicago? Margaret, I'm retired. My boys are grown and settled. My ex-wife is dating a very nice orthodontist and doesn't need me to fix her garbage disposal anymore. My life in Chicago is pleasant, but it's not essential. It's not rooted in anything I can't transplant. And if we try this and it doesn't work, then we'll have tried. We'll know, and we'll both be able to close that chapter of our lives with peace instead of wondering. I pulled my hands free and picked up my coffee cup, buying time to think. The coffee was strong and bitter, like the decision I was facing. Around us, the late afternoon crowd was thinning out, early diners claiming tables. The shift from lunch to dinner, marking the passage of time I'd barely noticed. I have routines, I said finally. Responsibilities. Sarah needs me, especially since her divorce last year. I volunteer at the library. I have my book club, my garden club. I can't just abandon my life. I'm not asking you to abandon anything. I'm asking you to expand it, to let me be part of it. What about your life, your routines? What routines? I play golf twice a week with men who talk about their ailments and complain about their wives. I volunteer at the animal shelter because dogs don't judge you for being lonely. I have season tickets to the Cubs that I share with my neighbor because I can't stand going alone. He paused. Margaret, I've been existing, not living, just like you. The honesty in his voice broke something loose in my chest. God, we're a pair of pathetic old fools, aren't we? Maybe, but we're pathetic old fools who found each other again. That has to count for something. I looked around the restaurant, at couples, young and old, sharing meals and conversation, at families navigating the ordinary complexities of daily life. What would Robert think if he could see me now? Would he want me to be cautious, to preserve the quiet life we'd built together? Or would he want me to be happy, To take the chance at love that was sitting across from me, asking for nothing more than possibility. I need time, I said finally. Of course. How much time? I don't know. A few days, a week? Take as long as you need. But Margaret? He waited until I met his eyes. Don't think too much. Sometimes the heart knows things the mind can't figure out. We sat in silence for a while, finishing our coffee and watching the light change outside the restaurant windows. The sun was setting earlier now, September announcing the approach of autumn, of change, of decisions that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Finally, Thomas glanced at his watch. I should probably let you get home. Sarah's expecting you for dinner, isn't she? Yes, she is. She's making pot roast and interrogation, her two specialties. He laughed. Will you tell her about today? Some of it. She's very protective since Robert died. She thinks anyone who shows interest in me must be after something. Smart girl. What am I after, do you think? The question was light, but I heard the serious undertone. A second chance. Maybe redemption for choices we made 40 years ago. And is that so terrible? No, I said slowly. I don't think it is. We paid the check, he insisted, despite my protest, and walked out into the parking lot together. The evening air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of late summer and the promise of autumn. My car was parked next to his rental, a coincidence that felt like a sign. Will you call me? He asked as we stood between our cars like awkward teenagers. When you've had time to think? Yes. Promise? I promise. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his blue-gray eyes, close enough to smell his cologne and the underlying scent that was purely him. Can I kiss you goodbye? My heart hammered against my ribs. Thomas? Just goodbye, nothing more. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he leaned down to brush his lips gently against mine. It was soft and careful and over almost before it began, nothing like the passionate kisses we'd shared at 18. But it was perfect, mature and grateful and full of possibility. Drive safely, he said, stepping back. Text me when you get home so I know you made it. I will. Margaret? I paused with my hand on the car door. Yes? For what it's worth, I think we're exactly the right age for this. We're old enough to know what we want and young enough to go after it. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into traffic, before I got in my own car and sat for a moment in the gathering dusk. My lips still tingled from his kiss, and my mind was reeling with everything that had been said and implied over the past 3 hours. The drive home passed in a blur of memory and possibility. I took the long way, past the high school where we'd met, past the park where we'd had our first kiss, past all the landmarks of a love I thought was buried with my youth. But it wasn't buried. It was dormant, waiting, and Thomas's return had watered seeds I thought were dead. Sarah's car was already in my driveway when I arrived, and I could see lights spilling from my kitchen windows. She'd let herself in with her spare key and was probably already setting the table, preparing for the interrogation she'd promised. I sat in my car for a moment longer, gathering my thoughts and trying to prepare answers for questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The front door opened before I reached it, Sarah silhouetted in the light like a worried parent waiting for a teenager to come home from a date, which I supposed wasn't far from the truth. "Mom!" She wrapped me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and anxiety. "How did it go? Tell me everything. Was he awful? Was he wonderful? Are you okay?" I hugged her back, this beautiful daughter who had inherited my stubbornness and her father's kind heart, who loved me enough to meddle in my love life and worry about my happiness. "Let me get inside first," I said, laughing despite my emotional exhaustion. "Then we'll talk." The house smelled like pot roast and homemade biscuits, comfort food for a conversation Sarah clearly expected to be complicated. She'd set the table with my good china, the set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift and rarely used except for holidays. She'd even lit candles. "This looks lovely, sweetheart. I thought you might need some pampering after your big afternoon." She pulled out my chair like a gentleman, then served us both generous portions of roast and vegetables. "Now, talk. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." So I told her about Thomas, about the boy I'd loved and lost, about the man he'd become. I told her about our conversation, about the way he still made my heart race, about the possibilities and fears swirling through my mind like autumn leaves in a windstorm. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression cycling through surprise, concern, and something that looked like hope. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied my face. "You love him," she said finally. "I loved him. Past tense. I don't know what this is now." "Mom, I've been watching you for 2 years, watching you go through the motions of living without really engaging with life. Tonight is the first time since Dad died that you look present, alive. Whatever this is with Thomas, it's waking you up. That doesn't mean it's wise. When has love ever been wise?" She reached across the table and took my hand. "Dad would want this for you, you know? He would want you to have someone who makes you light up the way you're lighting up right now. How can you be sure? Because he loved you, really loved you, not just needed you or was comfortable with you. He knew there were parts of you that he couldn't reach, and it didn't make him love you less. If anything, it made him appreciate the parts of you he could have." Tears filled my eyes at her words, at the generosity of spirit she was showing, at the way she was giving me permission to move forward without guilt. "Are you scared?" she asked gently. "Terrified. Good. Dad always said the best decisions were the ones that scared you a little." We talked until nearly midnight, working through my fears and hopes and the practical considerations of starting something new at 61. Sarah asked good questions about Thomas's character, his intentions, his availability. But underneath her protective instincts, I could see her excitement for me. "What does your gut tell you?" she asked as we cleared the dishes. I considered the question while I rinsed plates and loaded the dishwasher. What did my gut tell me? It told me that sitting across from Thomas today had felt like coming home after a long journey. It told me that the part of myself I'd kept hidden for decades had emerged effortlessly in his presence. It told me that at 61, I was finally brave enough to choose love over safety. "It tells me to say yes," I admitted. "Then say yes." After Sarah left, I sat in my quiet house and felt the silence differently than I had for the past 2 years. It wasn't oppressive anymore, weighted with loneliness and the absence of Robert's presence. It was expectant, full of possibility and the promise of change. I pulled out my phone and found Thomas's number, then stared at it for a long time before typing, "Made it home safely. Thank you for today." It was enlightening. His response came within minutes. "Thank you for being brave enough to say yes to coffee. Sleep well, Margaret. And remember, the heart knows." I smiled at my phone like a teenager and went upstairs to bed. But sleep was elusive, my mind replaying every moment of our afternoon together, every word and glance and gesture. When I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamed of train stations and lost letters and second chances that came wrapped in silver hair and laugh lines. The next morning brought coffee and clarity in equal measure. I called Thomas before I could lose my nerve. "I've been thinking," I said when he answered. And I think you're right. I think we're exactly the right age for this." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm sure I want to find out." "What changed your mind?" I curled up in Robert's old recliner, the chair I'd been unable to sit in for 2 years, but somehow claimed this morning without thinking. My daughter reminded me that the best decisions are the ones that scare you a little. And Thomas, this scares me more than a little. Good scared or bad scared? Both. Terrifying and exhilarating and completely insane. Those are my favorite kinds of decisions. We talked for an hour, making tentative plans. He would extend his trip by 2 days. I would show him around town, introduce him to my favorite places, my favorite people if I felt brave enough. We would take things slowly, carefully, like the mature adults we were supposed to be. I have one condition, I said as our conversation wound down. Anything. No promises about forever. We're both too old and too wise to make vows we might not be able to keep. Let's just see where this goes. Agreed. Though I have to tell you, Margaret, I'm optimistic about where this is going. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's chair and felt his presence around me, not oppressive or guilt-inducing, but warm and approving. He'd been gone 2 years, and I'd been faithful to his memory, to our life together. But he wouldn't want me to be faithful to loneliness, to the gray half-life I'd been living since his death. The doorbell rang at 10:30, interrupting my reverie. Sarah stood on my porch with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, her face bright with curiosity. "Well," she said, bustling into my kitchen, "did you call him?" "I did. And he's staying 2 more days. We're having dinner tonight." She squealed like a teenager and threw her arms around me. "Mom, this is so exciting. What are you going to wear? Where are you going? Do you need me to do your hair?" I laughed at her enthusiasm, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Slow down. It's just dinner." "It's not just dinner, and you know it. This is a second chance at something most people never get even once." She was right, of course. This wasn't just dinner. This was the beginning of something I couldn't quite name yet, something that felt both familiar and entirely new. Thomas picked me up at 6:30, arriving at my door with flowers, white roses that smelled like hope and new beginnings. He'd traded his sweater for a sport coat and tie, and I'd chosen an emerald green dress that Sarah had declared perfect after we debated my wardrobe for an hour. "You look beautiful," he said, and I believed him. He took me to Chez Laurent, the nicest restaurant in town, the place Robert and I had gone for anniversaries and special occasions. I felt a moment of guilt at being there with another man, but it passed quickly. Robert was gone, and I was still here, still capable of appreciating good food and better company. Over dinner, we talked about everything we'd been too nervous to discuss the day before. Thomas told me about his divorce, the slow dissolution of a marriage that had been more friendship than partnership for years. I told him about Robert's illness, the way cancer had stolen him piece by piece until only his essence remained, concentrated and precious in those final weeks. "Do you feel guilty?" he asked over dessert, "being here with me?" I considered the question honestly. A little, but not as much as I expected to. Robert and I had 37 good years together. We raised 2 wonderful children, built a life, took care of each other through sickness and health just like we promised. But he's been gone 2 years, Thomas. 2 years of me existing instead of living. He wouldn't want that for me. What would he want? He'd want me to be happy. He'd want me to laugh and travel and fall in love again if the opportunity presented itself. I met his eyes across the candlelit table. "I think he'd like you, actually. You're both good men, just different kinds of good. I'd like to think I could have been friends with any man you chose to love." The words sent warmth flooding through me. This was what I'd missed with Robert, not just passion, but understanding, the sense that someone saw me clearly and loved what they saw. After dinner, we drove to the lake on the edge of town, the same lake where we'd gone as teenagers to talk and dream and imagine our futures together. The moon was full, casting silver light across the water, and we sat on a bench and talked until nearly midnight. "Tell me your dreams," Thomas said, his arm around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. "Not the ones you had at 18, but the ones you have now." I thought about it, surprised to realize I had dreams I'd never articulated, even to myself. I want to travel. Really travel, not just tourist destinations, but places that matter. I want to see the northern lights and walk through lavender fields in Provence and sit in cafes in Vienna drinking coffee and watching people. I want to read all the books I've been meaning to read and have long conversations about them with someone who cares as much as I do. What else? I want to learn something new, take a cooking class maybe, or learn to paint. I want to surprise myself with what I'm capable of. Anything else? I was quiet for a moment, gathering courage. I want to fall in love again. Not the desperate, consuming love of teenagers, but the deep, grateful love of people who know what they found. "I can help with some of those things," he said softly. "Which ones?" "All of them." We kissed then, properly this time, with all the passion we'd held back the day before. It was different from kissing at 18, slower, more intentional, weighted with the knowledge of how precious and rare this connection was. When we broke apart, we were both breathless. "I should take you home," he said, but neither of us moved. "You should," I agreed, making no effort to leave his arms. We stayed until the moon set, talking and kissing and marveling at the strange alchemy that had brought us back together after 4 decades apart. When he finally drove me home, we sat in his car in my driveway like teenagers, unwilling to end the evening. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow." "I love you, Margaret. I need you to know that. Not just the memory of you, but who you are right now, today. I love your wisdom and your vulnerability and the way you think about the world." Thomas, you don't have to say it back. I just needed to say it. But I wanted to say it back. The words were there, had been there since yesterday afternoon, waiting for courage to give them voice. I love you too. It terrifies me and thrills me and makes no practical sense whatsoever, but I love you. The next morning, I woke with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. Thomas picked me up at 10, and we spent the day exploring my town through his eyes. The bookstore where I'd worked part-time while the kids were small, the park where I'd taken them to play, the cemetery where Robert was buried. I'd been nervous about that last stop, but Thomas was perfect, respectful and quiet, letting me have a moment alone at Robert's grave while he waited by the car. I told Robert about Thomas, about the chance I was taking, about how grateful I was for the life we'd shared and how ready I was to start a new chapter. "Thank you," Thomas said as we drove away, "for letting me be part of that. Thank you for understanding how important it was." We had lunch at the diner where I'd worked as a teenager, the same diner where Thomas had picked me up after school every day senior year. Marge, the owner, was still there at 78, and she recognized Thomas immediately. "Tommy Mitchell!" she exclaimed, wrapping him in a hug that left flower handprints on his shirt. "I heard you were back in town. You two finally figured it out, did you?" "Figured what out?" I asked, laughing. "That you belong together. Even when you were kids, anyone with eyes could see you were meant to be. Took you long enough." Over pie and coffee, she regaled us with stories of our teenage selves, how we'd sit in the corner booth for hours, sharing one milkshake and gazing at each other like the world began and ended in each other's eyes, how we'd been so obviously completely in love that she'd started planning our wedding in her head. "Life's funny," she said as we prepared to leave. "Sometimes it takes you the long way around to get where you're supposed to be." That afternoon, we walked through downtown, past stores that had changed hands multiple times since we were young, past the movie theater where we'd had our first date, past the fountain where Thomas had kissed me for the first time. Everything was different and exactly the same, like looking at our past through a lens that made it both distant and immediate. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we'd made different choices? I asked as we sat by the fountain, watching children feed ducks while their mothers chatted on benches nearby. Every day for the first 10 years. Then I made peace with it, mostly. But Margaret, I don't think we would have made it if we tried to stay together then. Why not? Because we were too young, too scared, too uncertain about who we were or what we wanted. We needed to become the people we are now, people who've loved and lost and learned what really matters, before we could love each other the way we deserve to be loved. I thought about his words as we watched the ducks paddle across the pond, their movements graceful and sure. Maybe he was right. Maybe we'd needed 40 years of living, of making mistakes and finding our way and becoming fully ourselves before we could come back to each other as complete people rather than works in progress. That evening, our last together before he had to return to Chicago, we had dinner at my house. I cooked, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad and the kind of comfortable meal you share with someone you want to know better. We drank wine and talked about books, and I showed him the margins of my favorite novels, the notes I'd written over the years that amounted to a decades-long conversation with an absent friend. "Look at this," he said, reading my annotations in Jane Eyre. "You wrote, 'Thomas would hate Rochester' in chapter 14. You would have. Too brooding, too manipulative. You're right. I always preferred Captain Wentworth anyway. Of course you did. Noble and patient and willing to wait for the woman he loved. Is that what I'm doing? Waiting?" The question hung between us, loaded with meaning. I don't know. Are you? I'm hoping. There's a difference. After dinner, we sat on my back porch swing, the one Robert had hung for me 10 years ago that I'd barely used since his death. The evening was warm and still, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. Thomas held my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm, and we talked about practical things, how often we'd call, when he might visit again, whether I'd consider coming to Chicago. I've never lived anywhere but here, I confessed. This house, this town, it's all I've ever known. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm just asking you to visit, to see if you like my world enough to spend time in it. What if I don't? What if I'm too set in my ways, too small town for city life? Then we'll figure something else out. Margaret, I'm not trying to change you or uproot you. I'm trying to blend our lives together in whatever way works for both of us. When it was time for him to leave, we stood in my front hallway like awkward teenagers, both of us knowing this was important, this goodbye that would determine what came next. "I'll call you tomorrow night when I get home," he said. "I'll be waiting." "And you'll think about Chicago? Maybe next month?" "I'll think about it." He kissed me then, deep and sweet and full of promise, and I let myself believe that this could work, that love at 61 could be just as real and transformative as love at 18. After his taxi arrived and he was gone, I sat in my quiet house and felt the silence differently than I had before he'd walked back into my life. It wasn't empty anymore. It was expectant, full of possibility and the promise of phone calls and visits, and maybe, eventually, something more permanent. The phone rang at 9:30 the next evening. Thomas, calling from his condo in Evanston, his voice tired but happy. "I'm home," he said, "safe and sound and missing you already." "I miss you too. Have you thought about Chicago?" "I've thought about nothing else." We talked for 2 hours, making plans. I would visit in 3 weeks, stay for a long weekend, let him show me his world. If I liked it, if we liked being together in his space as much as we'd enjoyed being together in mine, we'd talk about what came next. "No pressure," he said as we prepared to hang up. "Just come with an open mind and an open heart." "I can do that." "I love you, Margaret." "I love you too." After we hung up, I called Sarah and told her about Chicago, about the leap of faith I was preparing to take. She was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. "Mom, are you sure about this?" "No, but I'm sure I want to try." "What if it doesn't work out?" "Then I'll come home and get back to my quiet life. But at least I'll know. At least I'll have tried." She was quiet again. Then, "Dad would be proud of you, for being brave enough to love again." 3 weeks later, I boarded a plane to Chicago with one suitcase and a heart full of hope and terror. Thomas met me at the gate, flowers in hand, his face bright with anticipation. The city was everything I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. Loud and crowded and full of energy that made me feel both overwhelmed and exhilarated. His condo was beautiful, high ceilings and tall windows, and a view of Lake Michigan that took my breath away. But more than the space itself, I loved the way he'd filled it with books and music and photographs of his children and grandchildren. I loved the kitchen where he made me coffee in the morning, and the balcony where we sat in the evenings watching the sunset paint the lake gold and pink. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. He showed me his favorite restaurants, his favorite museums, the bookstore where he spent Saturday mornings reading newspapers from around the world. I met his friends, couples our age, who welcomed me warmly and seemed genuinely happy that Thomas had found someone who made him smile like a schoolboy. On Sunday afternoon, we walked along the lakeshore, and I understood why he loved this city. It had energy and culture and beauty, but it also had quiet spaces, places where you could think and dream and remember what mattered. "So," he asked as we sat on a bench watching boats bob in the harbor, "what do you think?" "I think," I said carefully, "that I could learn to love it here. Even if it means leaving your town, your routines." "Thomas, I've been thinking about this for weeks. My routines were just ways of filling time until I died. But this, being with you, exploring new places, having someone to share experiences with, this is living." He turned to face me on the bench, his expression serious. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to try. Not marriage, not yet. We're both too smart to rush into that. But maybe I could spend part of my time here, part of my time at home. Maybe we could build something together that honors both our lives." "You'd really do that? Leave everything familiar?" "I'm not leaving everything. I'm expanding everything. There's a difference." He kissed me then, right there on the bench with joggers and dog walkers passing by, and I didn't care who saw us. I was 61 years old and in love and finally brave enough to choose happiness over safety. 6 months later, I was dividing my time between my hometown and Chicago, spending 2 weeks in each place and finding that both felt like home now. Thomas had helped me find a small apartment near his condo, a place that was mine, but close enough to his that we could have coffee together every morning when I was in town. Sarah had been skeptical at first, worried that I was moving too fast, changing too much too quickly. But when she came to visit and saw how happy I was, how alive I looked, she relaxed. "You're different, Mom," she said as we walked through Millennium Park, Thomas having diplomatically given us time alone together. "You're more yourself, if that makes sense." It makes perfect sense. I feel like I've been sleepwalking for years, and suddenly I'm awake again. "Are you happy?" I considered the question as we sat by the fountain, watching children play in the water while their parents looked on with the patient love I remembered from my own young motherhood. Was I happy? I was something more complex than happy. I was fulfilled. I was challenged. I was growing in ways I hadn't expected at my age. "Yes," I said finally, "I'm happy in a way I never knew was possible." A year after our reunion, Thomas and I took that trip to Ireland we'd dreamed about as teenagers. We rented a car and drove through the countryside, staying in bed and breakfasts and talking to locals in pubs and walking through ancient ruins that had stood for thousands of years. On our last night in a small hotel in Galway, Thomas pulled out a small velvet box. "Before you panic," he said, seeing my expression, "this isn't what you think it is." Inside was not an engagement ring, but a simple gold band set with a small emerald. "It's a promise ring," he explained. "Not a promise to marry me, though I hope you'll consider that someday. A promise that whatever happens, whatever we decide about the future, this time together has been real and important and worth celebrating." I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it caught the lamplight and sparkled like hope. "Thomas, I know we said no promises about forever, but Margaret, I need you to know that I would marry you tomorrow if you wanted. I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking this chance on us." I looked at this man who'd loved me as a girl and chosen to love me as a woman, who'd waited 40 years to find me again and was patient enough to let me set the pace of our future. I thought about Robert, who'd given me a good life, and about the different kinds of love that were possible at different stages of life. "Ask me again in 6 months," I said, "when we've had more time to be sure this isn't just the romance of reunion, when we've navigated a few more challenges together. I can do that." And he did. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday morning in my kitchen in our hometown, Thomas got down on one knee and asked me to marry him properly. I said yes without hesitation, and we were married 3 months later in a small ceremony in my backyard, surrounded by our children and grandchildren and the friends who'd watched us find our way back to each other. I kept my apartment in Chicago and my house in the hometown where I'd raised my children. Thomas and I split our time between both places, and I discovered that home wasn't a place, but a person, wasn't geography, but the space you created when you chose to love someone completely. On our first anniversary, sitting on my back porch swing watching my grandchildren play in the yard while Thomas grilled dinner and Sarah and her new boyfriend, a kind man she'd met at book club, set the table, I marveled at how much my life had changed. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, settling beside me on the swing with 2 glasses of wine. I thought about it honestly. Did I regret the 40 years we'd spent apart? The different lives we'd lived, the other people we'd loved, the children we'd raised, and the experiences we'd had separately? "No," I said finally. "I don't regret any of it, because it all led us here, to this moment, to these people we've become who are capable of loving each other this way." Even the lost time? Even the lost time, because it wasn't really lost, was it? It was just preparation. We were becoming the people who could have this conversation, who could choose love over fear, who could build something beautiful out of second chances. He kissed the top of my head, and we swung gently in the evening breeze, watching our blended family enjoy the life we'd created together. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, and I thought about all the journeys that had brought us to this place. The trains that had taken us away from each other, the roads that had led us back. Time had taken Thomas away from me, yes, but the reunion had given me back both my past and a new tomorrow. And that tomorrow stretched out before us like a promise, full of possibility and adventure, and the deep, grateful love of people who'd found each other, not once, but twice, and were wise enough to hold on this time. In the end, that's what love is at our age, not the desperate passion of youth, but the patient choice to keep choosing each other, day after day, for whatever time we have left. And we have time. We have gardens to plant and books to read and grandchildren to spoil and trips to take and quiet mornings drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. We have the rest of our lives to love each other properly, completely, with all the wisdom we've gained and all the tenderness we've learned. And that, I think, as Thomas takes my hand and we walk inside to join our family, is the best kind of love story there is. Not the one about first love, but the one about last love, about the love that carries you home.